Hello minders, welcome back to the Mind of Watercolor. Thought what we would talk about today are flesh tones. My last portrait video was very well received, and I thought a good way to follow up on last week's episode was to talk about flesh tones. I've been asked many times to do a video on how to mix flesh tones in watercolor. And we're going to take a look at that. There's no one way, and there are so many colors involved in flesh tone. So it's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I'll show you how I approach it and just look at some of the colors that I might choose. And I think probably the best way to start off is let's look at some photos. I mean, to begin with, we have to acknowledge that there are so many flesh tones out there. I picked 4 photos from a stock photo site just to kind of demonstrate the array. I mean, you have all the way from real fair, almost kind of ruddy skin to more of an average light skin to more of an olive, light brown to a darker brown. And every range in between, and even darker and even lighter. But before I dive into the way they break down kind of on the face, let's just look at the colors and what they are. I'm actually using my core palette today, and what I want you to do is not get caught up in the names, alright? It's just very, very easy for beginners to get so caught up in naming the exact color. Really, to progress in watercolor and color mixing, you've got to learn to mix visually. You've got to be able to paint with just about any set of colors that are similar, and don't get bogged down in naming that exact color. It's true there are some subtle differences between each of the colors. Doesn't mean that when you're swatching out and choosing colors for a palette, you can't get specific and nail it down to particular properties and names of colors. But once you start painting, you know, a lot of that's out the window. You just have to start mixing visually and start saying, I'm going to add a little bit of this cooler red to this warmer red to this yellow to whatever. If I name a color that would make a good flesh tone, I'm not going to be able to name for you, 15 other different ones that would match up to that. You're going to kind of have to do that visually if you don't have that particular color, but you should be able to do it just by comparing color charts and getting close. Alright, I've cleaned off my palette. If you spend any time looking at watercolor, you know that there aren't any pastels in watercolor, not any light colors right out of the tube. Everything is fairly vibrant or deep, and so that means that you're using a pale wash of some color. So what is flesh tone? I mean, what color are we talking about? Let's talk about light skin first, like Caucasian skin, for example. Identifying those colors may be a little difficult because you look on the palette, on a watercolor palette, and you see, oh, there's a bright red, there's a bright orange, there's a bright gold or bright yellow. Flesh is right in this category. We're going to start down here, and I'm not going to do like a whole range. I'm just going to do a light and a dark, and they're pretty easy from there to adjust. So this is Pyrrol orange, and then some of this. This is Quinacridone Red. That is what I would call, for lighter skinned humans, that is what I would call my base color, okay? And there are just a number of ways you're going to augment it. So let's look at this. If I take the Quinacridone Red and I add a little bit of the orange to it, mix that, then I pull that down into a pale wash, hopefully you see a flesh tone. Having a palette set up like that is great, because then when you have this base flesh tone, you can start pushing it in different directions. Over to the ruddier side. Fair skin, really fair skinned people tend to have a ruddier complexion. More olive skin people tend to pull this way. As you get into the shadows, one of the simplest ways to augment shadows, or to push something into a shadow, is this is neutral tint. This is Payne's Gray, which is a little cooler. So I'm going to bring some Pyrrol orange up here, Quinacridone Red. I'm kind of using my paper as a mixing platform here. Now I've got some ways to mix into the shadows. Now keep in mind when you do faces that light matters, and for instance, I would probably also have out on my mixing area a brown. This is VanDyke brown, and that mixes very well you know, with these flesh tones, the red and the orange. Mixing on paper, I wouldn't do this if I were painting, but just so you can see it. So, you know, through kind of shifting either of these ways, I can go from cooler shadows to warmer shadows, between Payne's gray, a neutral tint, and maybe a brown, like a burnt umber, or in this case VanDyke brown. Alright, so that's one approach, and just to show you how flexible this can be, and how many ways you can make flesh tone. And again, we're dealing with light flesh here. I will get to dark flesh in a minute. Here's a method I tend to use a lot. When you get into the lighter areas, when there's a lot of dynamics, you know, light and dark dynamics, shadow, I like to have some yellows. What you can do is split the analogous colors further apart and still be able to make the same thing. So instead of orange, maybe I have an Indian yellow. And instead of the Quinacridone Red, maybe I go cooler. This is Quinacridone Magenta. Another one would be Quinacridone Rose or Quinacridone Violet. You can see I just split those analogous colors a little farther apart on the color wheel, if you don't know what I mean by split. These were pretty close on the color wheel, maybe with like a brilliant red in between. These are a little further apart, but same thing. So we'll look what happens. I mix them together. I'm getting an orangey peach color, which is the foundation basically of light flesh. And depending on which way I bend it, you know, as I make it paler through my wash, I have the same thing. But now I have a much wider range of color. And when I get out into the highlights, the bright highlights, I can use just a real pale highlights of yellow, which is what I usually like to do. And as you get into the redder areas, although that's a bit intense, you can do that. And a lot of times on the palette, I will even have some violet. So let me just throw that out here. And I will use violets. And again, I'm going to bring the VanDyke brown. Also think burnt umber, be pretty close. VanDyke brown and burnt umber, very similar. Let's mix those two. And I have a real nice sort of a violet brown, and that's a fairly decent shadow color. So let's put a little of that Quinacridone Magenta in there and just a tad of the Indian yellow. And now I'm getting some nice shadow color for flesh. And you can come back to the Payne's gray. This is a nice cool, if you want to add a nice cool shadow. Again, it will depend on your light, the light on your subject. If you have really cool shadows, you may want to bring in the Payne's gray. And as I did over here, neutral tint is always a good fail-safe. So let me refresh the color in these. Again, depending on how deep your shadows are. You know, here we're looking a little green because that's the Payne's gray mixing with the Indian yellow. I've got a lot of Indian yellow. But that kind of brings up a good point, because you will notice a lot of green in flesh tones, especially in recessed areas or areas where the skin is kind of thin, like the upper part of the bridge of the nose, or below the lip on the chin. It's because the blood vessels are close to the surface. It'll either be just a slight green tint or a bluish green tint. I mean, just very, very faint. You start to get too much yellow, and you've been using something like Payne's gray for a shadow, you can kill that green by just adding a little red. So I've got a big soup of all kind of color here, I know. But, I mean, I could literally push the shadows in the recessed areas of, and I'm talking face mainly, that's where you'll see the greatest changes. But if I paint this and mix it all together and paint this out, I got a really nice, decent, deeper flesh color. So just a couple ways to handle that. You know, again, like I say, don't get hung up on the names. Get some color charts, look at them for yourself, and sort of keep them in this family. All right, let's look at dark flesh tones. And in reality, there's probably more variety in dark flesh tones than there is in the lighter flesh. And, you know, and everything in between, like I said. So you have to kind of adjust. Human flesh tone begins to get darker, more olive, more brown. It can just go in a number of ways. And usually the biggest variety I see is between cool and warm. But what I'm going to do is just show you a couple ways I would mix. Again, I'm going to pull out my VanDyke brown Again, that would also translate to burnt umber. Probably on my palette have next to that some red. And in that case, that's actually a Quinacridone Magenta, not red. And I'm getting some Quinacridone Gold. Over here, that's a very vibrant yellow, but it's darker. And darker skins usually tend to be yellower. They're not as ruddy. You won't find as many reddish colors in them, but you will find it. So just keep on the lookout for that. And I'm mixing very dark, and this is also very intense. So I usually start that way because I can see color better. So that's sort of a tip. You know, don't be afraid to mix these intense colors so you can see what color you're getting. And then, you know, when you make them paler, you know, they're going to look just right. So I might throw a little bit of transparent yellow oxide in there, which that's like a yellow ochre. So a yellow ochre-ish color. And now I have the range from the reddish to the orangish to the yellow. And so in the highlights, you may end up with that. In the shadows, you may end up with something like that. And you can add some neutral tint to that. We get a little more burnt umber in there. And a little more, just a touch more of Quinacridone Magenta. So one of the challenges you have with dark skin is cutting back on the intensity without cutting back on the value, because you know, it is dark, so you want to keep it dark. And so this is a good place to bring in your neutral tint. So here I just turned all of that into a very umberish color, but I'm getting the color, you know, I would say an average dark skinned person would have. And there, again, I just can't stress enough. I mean, I don't have to tell you, you know, you all walk the streets, you know how much variety there is in skin tone. So, but we have a start. We have a palette that can be pushed in lots of ways. And just to make it clearer, I'm going to push out some of the purer colors out here so you can see what it came from. And some of these are kind of mixing on my brush, but that's the neutral tint. You won't use a lot of Payne's Gray in dark skin, but then again, you might depending on the light. So I'm going to go ahead and throw that in there. Just I would have probably all of this out on my palette pooling together. Yeah, I mean, see, this Payne's Gray would work great in some shadow areas, some of the thinner skin where the blood veins are showing. Something like neutral tint will be very important. You can also cut back on the intensity of this stuff with complements, but in browns like this, it's going to be difficult to find. You're going to be spending a lot of time finding the exact complement. So I would just cut my losses and go for the neutral tint. And you know, that would make a nice palette, a nice mixing area of color for me to start painting, you know, an African American or an African or an Indian or an Aboriginal, you know, who knows. But I would have just about everything I need for that. And if I wanted to get into lighter skin, like Asian, Mediterranean people, Latino, I could still lighten it up and I would have a very good palette there. Let's do it a different way. And again, I like illustrating for you how different you can do these. It's Diox purple, which is very strong, very powerful purple. And you notice, as I mentioned earlier, how many different colors I have to get involved for dark skin. That's Diox purple. That's Quinacridone Magenta. This is transparent yellow oxide, which is a type almost like yellow ochre, or raw sienna would work too. Now this is a yellow and this is a purple, so those are complements. This would be a good mix for a cooler skin person that has dark skin. So when you mix purple and yellow, in this case, you know, a darker yellow, you start getting almost a raw umber. I don't have raw umber on this palette, so I can't pull it out. That's another one. I mean, just lots of options. And so I pull up, putting some more of that Quinacridone Magenta out, just where I want to keep it warm. And there you see, I have a really nice dark flesh tone. A little different, and I can just push it anyway. And you know, I haven't used orange, but I used the Quinacridone Gold, which was close to an orange, but yellower. This is Pyrrol orange like we used in light flush. In some cases, that would be appropriate depending on your subject. A lot of dark-skinned people have orange hues, but a lot of them move more to the cool side, so you have to really look. And again, it almost goes without saying, if you need it, pull out into your mixing area some neutral tint and possibly some Payne's gray. And I'll show you how I would work this into a face on both types in just a minute. But let's spend a minute, and this is something I really highly recommend, that you spend some time studying some photos. I would consider this woman here a fairly average light-skinned person. This little boy down here is a fairer skin and ruddier. This is a good representation here of a more olive skin or lighter dark-skinned person and a typical dark-skinned person, although skin can get a lot darker, obviously. But in every case, look through and see how color changes from the highlight to the shadow. I don't mean just value. Now, value is important too, but the color changes. And that is the key to getting really good facial color, is not to paint it monotone. There are so many portrait artists that paint faces monotone. When I paint faces in acrylic or oil or gouache, the one thing I rarely ever used was portrait pink. Couldn't stand portrait pink. And that's obviously for light-skinned people. I mean, if you're very aware of the changes in color from shade to light, that's fine, you can use it. I'm not saying you can't use it. I just didn't. I liked forcing myself to mix the colors and make them a little more lively and interesting. So I just didn't use portrait pink. You know, you do have some areas that tend to average out, but you want to pay close attention to how the colors change. Of course, everybody knows the rosy cheeks. Everybody is aware of the redder lip. But look at these highlights. And if you look closely, I don't know how well my video is going to pick up the color, but these are really tending towards yellow, and depending on your light, that will even be more enhanced. Same here. Now, we don't go to a ruddier color so much in the shadows. It's more orange and brown orange, but you still have very yellow highlights. Same with this gentleman. Very yellow to deep umber, kind of raw umber to burnt umberish colors. Just keep those color changes in mind. It makes the face very interesting. Now, I mentioned earlier green. Now, you'll pick that up, and a lot of times you'll see green in less thick skin. Like a lot of time, and it also depends, of course, on the lighting. But you'll see, like inside the bridge of the nose, sometimes it'll be green. Sometimes, I'm not showing anyone's chin very well, but a lot of times down in the chin, just under the lip where the skin is thinner, it'll be green. You can't really see, but if you had a very thin person with sunken cheeks, a lot of times it'll be greenish in there where the jawbone, the skin is almost touching the jawbone. So look for those clues. So this is probably a little bit light, but we'll just show you roughly and quickly how I would break this down. Using those mixes I showed you before, I make these shadow areas usually a little warmer, or a little redder, I should say. That's all pretty warm. And you can see I've left most of the highlight areas. I would probably start shifting a little more now towards some yellow. So as you study faces, you will notice how certain areas pick up light and highlights. And that would be probably a good middle value layout or lay down. Now I'm going to shift down to the Quinacridone Magenta. I'm going to bring in some neutral tint to darken it. In this case, that's fairly neutral shadows. As I mentioned before, your light will do different things. For instance, someone outside, if it's a sunny day, you're going to have very warm highlights and very cold blue shadows. That's because when you're in shadow, you pick up the blue of the sky. So just be mindful and pay attention to what you're seeing. Observation is always your friend. I just don't like formulas. You learn how to paint one thing, maybe. And if you don't know why you did what you did, then that formula really didn't do you any good. So that's an exaggerated look at how you would apply those. All right, let's go to the darker skin. And I'm going to start with more of a sort of a slightly neutralized VanDyke brown. And I'm going to have this dark skin be fairly warm. Now I'm adding some Indian yellow. This is not extremely dark skin here. But I don't want to get it so dark contrast is not picking up well on camera. This one's starting to get a little messy. But I hope you can see. I'm mainly just trying to map colors for you. That's fairly monochromatic, but what I might do would be to pull in a little bit of purple just to add some interest in some of these deeper shadows. And if I were painting dark skin, I would probably spend more time working the values down with layers. Dark skin can be extremely luminous. I mean, and really, really neat. And one of the best ways to do that is to layer and get, different colors working in different areas. A lot of more dramatic color changes. We'll go back to our example. If you look at this gentleman here, just some very dramatic color changes from light, very, very pale, slightly yellowish light to almost rusty colors to a very cool umber here. So you can see on this page more dramatic changes here. If you have yourself a nice mixing palette and these mixes laid out, bending the colors one way or another, you'll be pretty successful at the color changes. Same with a lighter flesh. Anyway, I hope that's helpful. If you have any questions, just put them down in the comments. Get out your paints and do some portrait painting. Thanks everyone. Appreciate it. Thank you patrons for your support, and we will see everybody in the next video. Bye-bye.